thoughts on that? Does that help a little bit with your thoughts on designing
Yeah,
themes?
yeah,
Notice.
definitely. I think I hadn't I hadn't thought about it that way, but it makes me feel like there was a deep rot at the core of that resolution system that I didn't know was there.
I would venture to say that with forgiving players, you might try it one way or the other and see.
Yeah, yeah.
Another
Oh,
difficulty is that when you play test a game where you say, okay, when you roll your dice, then describe. Okay, you roll your dice, then describe. And then when we're all done, we're kind of like counting, just tote up your successes as you go. And at the end, then we'll look at all the successes and see who won or something like that. When you do
yeah,
that and you're playtesting with friends, they often put their best foot forward and try to fill it in with as much fun narration that they feel other people will enjoy as possible, because they
yeah,
have to. They have to, because if they don't, it's going to suck.
yeah.
So it's very easy to get the wrong impression from playtesting that this is awesome.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that I assumed that because in play the narration, the degree to which you narrated your own success depended upon how much higher the die you played was than the opponent. But I still feel like now, having talked to you about this, that that's still not that interesting, and it doesn't
It's a
really
bit more. It's
really
a bit of a
motivate me.
homework. It's got a homeworky feel to it, in my
Yeah, it's
experience.
like yeah,
Anything of that kind. Um, it is not to be confused with the fact that an outcome gets narrated almost no matter what. Sometimes it's not as colorful as our aesthetics might like, but the
yeah,
fact is, in the context of a number of different strikes during a complicated combat, if not every single one of them gets colorfully narrated, but enough do, we can split the difference. I don't have to demand that every single one of them. If this particular time I'm like, okay, 3 hits to his leg. All right, what do you do again? And then now it's your turn to go. Um, and we don't really get into it descriptively that particular time.
right,
If it's in a context that we are describing enough of it, if the statements of intent were engaging enough, then it's possible to fill in the gap imaginatively without too much trouble and without having to say it. So what I'm saying is that outcome narration, or specific coloring up of the outcome, not outcome narration with all of its content. I'm talking about coloring up the outcome. That is often best left to be emergent.
yeah,
The narration rules in Trollbabe, by which a failed roll is narrated by the player and a successful roll is narrated by the Trollbabe, that can apply either to a component of a conflict as well as to its outcome. Those are a little different because those are dealing with conclusive events rather than iterative, accumulative events.
right,
They are true turning points in the contest. The dynamic is very deliberate, that your troll babe is the imagery of what you think your character can tolerate in narration terms without being deprotagonized is up to you when she fails.
mm,
Describing her successes, the GM is required to validate the action, the intended action, as much as possible.
right,
So both of those, in that case, the narration rules are somewhat specified in content. What I'm trying to say is that you will find some post-effect narration rules that, if you look at them, though, they typically involve the ability to put in more content, not just color up what we already know.
right,
Coloring up what we already know is wonderful when it's emergent and frustrating and boring when it is only just working with something we would have done anyway and had no choice but to do. So options during a contest, if you're going to have finer grained resolution of a complicated contest of some kind, then the choices need to be real. The grains actually need to be real grains, not just beats of the same sequence that it would have been anyway.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I'm thinking about right now is that I never initially worked on the idea of the system with the thought of like I want this to be very colorful and everybody talks about it all the time, or talks. The narration was the key, but that it's a fast way to kind of describe or to do that iterative thing. You know what I mean?
But that.
But now that I'm thinking about it, I think that doesn't really matter, and it's still essentially the same thing. And
well, to get the effect you're talking about, what you need are options, so that when people say I'm doing this instead of that, it necessitates a certain amount of description. I mean, at the very least, and it often fosters somewhat more engaged description. As in, I really am, dropping and rolling instead of doing this other thing I could have done. And in that context, stating what you're doing going into it, and since you had options and could have done something else, and looking at the outcome of that particular moment, that roll does actually resolve that particular moment and therefore change up what you could be doing next. And that's one of the things about dogs that matters too. If the descriptions along the way, when you're pushing out dice in small numbers, if the descriptions along the way don't change what you might be able to do in the next go, if they don't change it, then again, there's not much point to it. The Sorcerer resolution system and the original Cyberpunk combat system, which they called Friday Night Firefight, aren't very much alike in some ways, but they are very much alike in terms of damage. And I want you to focus a little bit on this now, which are the negative consequences of finer grained resolutions. And that's one of the important points about dogs, is that you build fallout through those individualized moments throughout a conflict, if I recall correctly. In other words, you could win the contest, but take a lot of fallout along the way. Mainly by reserving your bigger dice for later, which means you keep taking the blow. If I recall their system correctly, that will wind you up with more fallout, even if you did have bigger dice and reserve them for the end, so that you do actually win the contest. You would have taken a lot of fallout along the way. So therefore, that, in my opinion, was the virtue of the design, which is that what you do push out in a given instance does matter in terms of fallout, but I also think it should matter in terms of the immediate fiction, like I was describing before. In terms of the direct damage of the moment, though, and I bring up both Sorcerer and the original Cyberpunk because they are notable for games of, well, they're separated by roughly a decade, but they are notable for the damage having an explosive effect on your character in the moment. Sorcerer has the fictional conceit that the permanent damage, so-called lasting damage that's done to you during the fight, is halved at the end of the fight. By definition, it's not as bad as it looked when all is said and done. But in the moment, during the fight, it's treated as if it were that bad. So you can think you've been, mortally wounded during the fight, and if you live, well, it turns out it wasn't that bad. Cyberpunk was not that forgiving. Cyberpunk basically blew your brains out.
Right.
And so, in a fairly crude fashion that I think we can all understand, heinous consequences in the moment can provide a great deal of attention to what your character is going to do in the moment. But that only works if they have options.
Right.
That only works if they have the option to try to avoid it, the option to give up something in order to make it through, or something like that. Either a responsive option or a preemptive one, depending on the way you want things to go. But if you're going to have heinous things occur, potentially, at that fine-grained level, you don't just wait for the end. If you are going to have that happen, then the tactics of the moment, the options at the moment, need to be quite broad and very different. And the king of that is actually champions. The ability to change up what you're doing from this phase to that phase is quite sophisticated in that game, if a little laborious. And the logic, however, is sound. That you really are thinking, all right, I can make I can push my endurance, which is going to eat right into my own stun, basically knocking yourself out or getting closer to being knocked out simply because you're trying so hard.
Right.
And I might miss. Or I can take a recovery. I can go use my stealth roll this phase and get undercover. With any luck, I'll be undercover while everybody else is shooting magnetic bolts at each other, and I can take my recovery. And then I can come out swinging, maybe by surprise.
Right.
Which way am I going to go? And that kind of thing plays very, very deeply into what someone else just did. If two of your teammates just got in a coordinated attack, which rocked the individual so that now they are stunned, wow, their defenses are way down. It's only going to last one phase, but their defenses are way down. I'm coming in with that Mondo punch that I was talking about.
Right.
If not, if they did some kind of like reactive martial throw on one of those characters streaking into attack, and our flying fast dude just got martial thrown into the water tower,
right.
Then, and yeah, the other guy hit, but it wasn't that bad a hit with just him, I might go over to the stealthy thing, and go and take my recovery. We'll see. So these kinds of skirmishy decisions in Champions, it helps. Remember we were talking about rolls and the shape of the roll? Champions is notable for its decisively bell-shaped resolution roll, 3d6.
Yeah.
In dice number of sides and number of dice, the 3d6 bell is where it's the fewest dice you can roll and still see a really beautiful bell.
Right.
So the point being that in Champions, all of these decisions I'm talking about have pluses and minuses to your roll to hit and to your defense, to your offense and your defense. A lot of this on all these different options. Given the nature of that curve, even a +1 matters.
Yeah. The
difference between 12 or less versus 13 or less, because you're trying to roll low. The difference between 12 or less or 13 or less you might accept the possibility of taking a really bad hit next time for the chance of having a +1.
Right.
So there's no trivial pluses or minuses in the system. Therefore, these decisions start to matter greatly, and that devolves directly onto the nature of the dice that are being used. Whereas somebody might say, well, why don't you just use a D20?
Right.
Well, if you're using a D20, then +2s are not nothing, but +5s are what you're really looking for.
Right.
That's, you're not really going to be very impressed by a +1. +1 isn't really going to make your day. You're not going to take the chance to get knocked silly next phase just for a measly +1 if you're using a D20. Using 3d6 or number or less, you may well do that.